Welcome, everyone. Today, we have the pleasure of having Professor Andrés Moya from the Economics Department at Universidad Los Andes, and who is a visiting fellow at the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies at Harvard University. Professor Moya will be talking today about promoting mental health and early childhood development in Colombia. Professor Moya research focuses on the economic, psychological, and behavioral consequences of violence and forced displacement in Colombia. In particular, Professor Moya has analyzed the effect of violence and psychological trauma on economic behavior, human capital accumulation, and performance in the labor market. So, Professor Moya, the floor is yours. Thanks.
So thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to present here. I'm going to be presenting the impact evaluation results of this program called Semillas de Apego, which roughly translates as seeds for attachment. And it's a project that it's a joint endeavor between psychologists at the University of California, San Francisco, and economists at the Universidad Los Andes, where I'm based. And the whole idea of this project is to promote maternal mental health and early childhood development in conflict-affected communities. So I'm going to be presenting the results for the RCT that we implemented in Colombia. And maybe just to start with a little bit of the motivation for this talk. Right now, and this is probably something that people here know very well. Right now, over 2 billion people are living in conflict-affected settings. Among these populations, children have been disproportionately affected. 450 million children globally, around 20% of children in the world, live and are born in these settings. And we have also witnessed the increase in displacement, both refugee flows and internal displacement in the past decades. Right now, by the end of 2021, we had 82 million displaced persons, including 35 million children. And of course, right now, we're actually witnessing, very sadly, the increase in displacement and refugee flows in the Ukraine. What we know is that the exposure to conflict and displacement can have very long-lasting consequences across different dimensions. It can take a toll on mental health. It can actually affect chronic poverty. It can thrust the populations into both economic, social, and technological poverty traps. And we know from previous research that it can hinder and affect early childhood development. And that by doing so, it can affect the life trajectories of many of these children. So of course, when we think about the magnitude of these problems and the magnitude of the conflicts across the globe, there's a main question in terms of how can we protect children and how can we prevent the intergenerational transmission of trauma and poverty in these conflict-affected settings. So this is the broad motivation that we're going to be working on. And we know, at least when we dig into the literature about the childhood development, we know that children need nurturing stimulation relationship with an adult for proper early childhood development. We know that these type of relationships are actually important for children to be able to process the stress that arises in maybe everyday settings. So these nurturing and caring relationships can actually buffer the psychological effects of stress. And these are effects that occur at both a neuronal and biological levels, to not only a behavioral effect. And based on this, we also know that toxic stress emerges when children are exposed to severe and systematic adversities, and when the adults are not available to provide these nurturing relationships. Right? So what happens when toxic stress is that the biological stress response systems of the children are being constantly activated. Think of children that has been experimenting displacement, poverty, exclusion. It's being bombarded by different adversities that are going to trigger this biological stress response system. And when the child doesn't receive that proper nurturing and caring relationship by the parent, this stress response is going to be constantly activated and pretty much in an overload. And this is going to have very negative effects on child's brain architecture, the number of connections of the neurons, the strength of the neuronal connections. And it's also going to affect their physical and mental health. and it's going to have very life-altering effects, right? And so the key question here is how to promote these nurturing relationships in context of conflict and forced displacement. And when we think about our project, we take a step back and we think about the binding constraint. So the binding constraint here is the capacity of caregivers to build these nurturing relationships. And we consider that these capacities are not exogenous. They're actually endogenous to the context of conflict. Conflict and displacement actually have negative consequences on caregivers' mental health. Parents who are struggling with trying to understand displacement, trying to cope with the shock of conflict, are actually going to have less emotional resources available to be able to understand what's happening at the same time to connect with their children. In Colombia, we know, for instance, that the incidence of at-risk symptoms of anxiety and depression are 3 to 4 times greater in conflict-affected regions than in other regions not affected by conflict. And we know that the severity of this psychological problems are going to drain the emotional resources of caregivers. And this is going to hinder their capacity to be emotionally available for children, right? So again, children are being affected by the stress that characterizes these conflict-affected settings, these settings of conflict and forced displacement. But at the time, their caregivers are also being affected. And this is going to drain their capacity to better connect in a nurturing and caring relationships with their children. And so this creates this concern for the toxic stress and the lifelong consequences that it's going to have on the children. So what we do, and this is the purpose of this talk, is we developed this program called Semillas de Apego. Again, it roughly translates as seeds for attachment. And it's a community-based psychosocial model for caregivers of young children who have also been affected by conflict and displacement. And in developing the program, we take a step back. And we again recognize this binding constraint. That the capacity of caregivers to provide these nurturing and care relationships is not exogenous. It's being affected at the same time by conflict and displacement. So we recognize that if we want to protect children and if we want to enhance these nurturing, caring relationships, we need to take a step back and think about the emotional resources of the caregivers. And we need to think about the maternal mental health in general. So the objective of the program is to promote maternal mental health as an outcome itself, a development outcome that's very important by itself. But also it's going to be important because it's a vehicle for us to promote healthy child-parent relationships and then to protect early child development. We implemented this program in a setting of active conflict. We're going to be working, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more later on. We're going to be working in a municipality in Colombia that has been chronically affected by conflict. 82% of the participants are victims of violence. 54% are actually internally displaced persons. We observed high levels of maternal mental health at baseline. And we also observed that conflict was happening at the same time as we were implementing the program. So this creates challenges for implementing and for evaluating these programs. And despite these challenges, what we see is, in a nutshell, very positive results at an 8-month follow-up in the 4 core dimensions that we intend to improve. So we see positive effects of 0.15 standard deviations in an index of maternal mental health, 0.23 standard deviations in an index of child-parent relationships, and we see effects of 0.17 and 0.21 standard deviations on early child mental health and early child development, respectively. So that's pretty much the summary of what we do. And let me just highlight a couple of contributions from our study. One, and as I've been trying to reinforce throughout this introduction, our program actually addresses maternal mental health explicitly. And this is a totally different approach from that of other successful parenting interventions that have been implemented in non-conflict settings. So we know about the very positive results of the Jamaica home visit intervention. We know about the different interventions and the evidence from the research program that actually builds up on the Jamaica program. This has been implemented in different countries in the region. It has also been implementing in Colombia, both in rural and urban areas. They're very positive results. We also know that these interventions that are based more in type of play-based learning are being currently adapted to respond to the Syrian refugee crisis, along with the Symptom program. But again, these programs and these interventions tackle a different constraint. So if we take a step back, maybe we can think that they tackle informational constraints on why and how to promote responsive care and stimulating environments. You have these both group-based and home visiting programs where a facilitator sits down with the family to start playing with the children and encourage the family to play with the children. So this is very important, and it addresses an important constraint. But again, this is a different constraint than the one that we're trying to address. We take a step back and we consider explicitly the role of maternal mental health in being able to promote this responsive care and stimulating environments. And this is actually important. There's actually few impact evaluations of early child development programs that are addressing deficits in maternal mental health. There's a recent paper that was published last year in Science, a review paper of 478 early child development evaluations. And what they find is that only 12% actually measure maternal mental health. And when they do this, it's often to try to identify dimensions for heterogeneity. So whether parents with better or worse maternal mental health are actually are having better or worse effects from the interventions. But what I think this highlights is that most of these programs are actually not considering the role of maternal mental health in improving these outcomes. The second contribution is that we're conducting this program, an experimental evaluation in a setting of active conflict. By 2018, there were only 5 evaluations being implemented in these conflict-affected settings, mostly in post-conflict settings, mostly in refugee camps. But here we're actually implementing the program in a setting where conflict is much alive, where there were struggles by different armed groups to control the coca drug trade in Colombia. And because of this, civilians were severely victimized at the same time as we were implementing the program. So these are caregivers that are affected by displacement, by ongoing conflict. And this creates a lot of challenges to implement and evaluate these programs. And this is actually going to map in the experimental design that we're going to follow and that I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And perhaps the third contribution is that we implement the program in a community-based model. The program is delivered by community members who had no prior experience. So we're going to train them and we're going to supervise them. And this allows us to overcome the deficits in local capacities and in professional mental health services that are characteristics of countries in the global south in general, and more so in conflict-affected settings. So these 3 contributions, taking maternal mental health explicitly in the design of the program, implementing the program in a context of active conflict, and doing so through a community-based model, are going to be the main contributions that we think actually allow us to observe the positive effects that we were seeing before. So that being said, let me skip into the description of the model. The Apego program, we designed the curriculum in 2014. We tested a pilot in Bogotá, an implementation pilot in Bogotá in 2015. And then we started running the impact evaluation in 2018. So where does the program come from? It's inspired by the work of our colleagues, Alicia Lieberman and Vilma Reyes at UCSF. Alicia had been working for more than 2 decades now on what's called the child-parent psychotherapy. This is a clinical intervention. It lasts 37 sessions per year between the child-parent dyad and a trained psychologist in the clinic. Its effectiveness has been demonstrated by 5 clinical trials with mostly Latino and Afro-American communities. Right? And then when they realized a little bit of the obstacles of scaling this up, they brought this out to the community. And that's the Building Bridges intervention that was led by Vilma Reyes in 2011. So these are at least the CPP in spirit.
It's a therapeutic session to enhance parents' capacity to provide safety and developmentally appropriate caregiving. It's been implemented in 37 states in the US, also in Palestine and Israel, and also I think in Nordic countries. Yep, you're good.
The camera is not focused on you, unfortunately.
Okay, so 1 second while we fix the camera. Sorry, camera control. So, but if I stand here?
Yes.
Yes, if you stand there, that would be great.
Here?
Yes.
Can you see him now?
Yes.
Can I do this from the, yeah.
Yeah, you should. I apologize for interrupting,
Yeah,
sir.
no problem. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, and so again, we contacted the team at UCSF in 2013. They had this track record of intervention, and so we adapted the program to the local context in Colombia. So what we were trying to understand, well, how do we adapt it to a context of ongoing conflict? It's different to the needs and the characteristics of Latino communities that migrated to the US, to California, and from which the original program actually emerged. It's a setting not of post-traumatic stress, because the conflict has not yet subsided. It's a context of current complex trauma, where the communities and the families are being constantly exposed to all of these bad things happening. And it also takes into account what we know as context-dependent parenting styles. So, for instance, some caregivers might become more, what you can say, authoritarian in these settings, and that's not generally bad. It's just a response to these kind of very difficult settings in which they live, right? So if something bad is happening and maybe you just want your kid to follow your order as a protective measure, right? So we adapted the program based on these settings in 2015. And how does it work? It's a group-based program. It's delivered in 15 weekly sessions. So participants meet. Groups of approximately 15 to 18 participants meet every week for 2.5 hours. Here. They meet for 2.5 hours. The sessions are led by 2 local facilitators. And the program tries to create, first, awareness on the emotional and psychological toll of conflict. In many of these settings, when we come in to talk to the communities, there's a sort of normalization of what's happening and how conflict is affected. And I think it has very important and evolutionary protective effects, but it also kind of doesn't allow them to process how they're affected, how it affects their emotions, how it affects also kind of their physical health, and how it translates into the children. Then it tries to create awareness on what else?
How did you choose the size of the group?
So it's based on the building bridges. So I don't think I have a good answer. That's the size of the group of the building bridges community program.
Because it seems a big group, 15 plus the children is 30 people.
So the children don't go. The children don't go to sessions. The children, and I'll tell you in a second why they don't go. And so at first, again, it tries to create this awareness about the emotional tools of conflict, and also tries to create awareness on how this affects their relationship with their children and how it's directly affecting children. And every time we get to a new site, sort of like parents tell us informally in the group discussions and the focus groups we conduct before implementing, that they don't think that their children are going to be affected because maybe they were too young to understand that their dad had been murdered, or to understand that there were like shots around, like gunshots and confrontations around the neighborhood. But actually, we know this is totally opposite. Maybe the children are not verbalizing what's happening, but their behavior and their brain development is actually reacting to these different settings. So we create awareness on these issues, and then the program what the program tries to do is to provide some tools so that caregivers can actually address some of these issues, so that they can work on their own mental health. They can work on the child-parent relationship and how this maps out into better childhood development and behavior, right? And in doing so, I think what the program tries to do is foster resilience. Try to understand and recognize that these are communities that are affected by systematic and pervasive conflict, and that they have within the families and the communities this source of resilience and strength. Right? And so, and we try to create this self-efficacy for the program. So how do sessions work? And here I go back to Horacio's comment. So it's only the caregivers come to the sessions. And the idea is that they're not coming in with their children, because otherwise this is gonna take away the focus from what's happening in their own emotional world to what's happening with the children in the sessions. Oh, and I'm gonna show you a couple of pictures here. Only the caregivers that are coming with very young children, in Spanish we say bebés de brazos, but they don't have anybody to take care of them while the sessions, they're only allowed to bring them up. And so the sessions follow a similar structure. At the beginning, there's a warm-up and a stress reduction practice. So sensory awareness, sometimes they practice some mindfulness exercises, some salutations like in yoga. Then they dig into the main activity. And this is basically a reflective practice. They start understanding and making this reflection in terms of how conflict affects them, how conflict is affecting their children and their relationship. And this is all grounded with arts and crafts to try to ground the information. And then at the end, there's a group discussion in which the participants then discuss how they can incorporate this into their everyday activities.
How do you recruit the participants?
So I'll tell you in 2 seconds, but these are families that participate in the early child development centers in Colombia. Right? And so the idea is that we're not trying to put a higher burden on these families, asking for women to do more than what they're already doing. What we try to highlight in this last group discussion is how they can incorporate some better and maybe more appropriately developmental activities into their everyday activities. Right? And how they can also start creating these child rearing teams, how they can start involving the fathers, how they can start involving other members in the community so that they can all contribute towards early child development. Okay, so these are the sessions. Actually, this is the one on the left is the first session. You can see that some participants are with their children there. There's a yarn and there's an activity in which they start kind of throwing the yarn between them, and we're trying to create some sort of a social structure and connectedness in these settings. The one on the right is one of I think it's the 10th session. You can see there's some arts and crafts here in the ground, and they're discussing what each of them actually worked on during the session, and again, how they can incorporate this into their everyday settings. So that's basically a program. And as I mentioned, this is a community-led program. Each group is led by 2 local facilitators. They're facilitators that have no formal training in psychosocial programs. In general, all of them had some type of social leadership. They had been leading some type of groups, but not in a very formal or structured way. And I think importantly, all of them are community members. All of them are mothers. All of them are exposed to the same sources of stress and adversity. And actually, some of them have been directly affected by violence. So how we build the local capacities is through a 5-week experiential training. They go through the full program, and it's only by them going to the full program that they can then replicate and lead the implementation.
How much formal education do they typically have?
So they all, at least at the minimum, they completed a bachelor's degree, and so and some have some diplomas in social work, technical diplomas in social work. I think one of them is a nurse. And what this does is it allows us to overcome deficit in mental health service, right? So in the setting where we're going to operate, setting severely affected by violence, there's only one psychologist that has been trained to provide some type of mental health service, right? And what we do, and I think this is an important building block of the program, is a weekly reflective supervision. So we have supervisors that meet with the facilitators, and the supervision is not focused on what they need to do next or the following week. The supervision instead is focused on the emotional well-being of these facilitators, because it's hard. They're already trying to understand and process their emotions and how this affects them, and now they have to lead these groups. So it's they actually meet for a full day every Friday on this reflective supervision, and I think this actually allows to build these local capacities.
There are two questions from the audience. So one is that if there is a referral system available for participants who are exhibiting severe stress symptomatology. And the other question is that if Venezuelan refugees are in the South.
So two very important questions. Thank you. So the first one is we do have a protocol of referrals. This protocol as we crafted it out for the IRB highlights it, like the necessary steps to go through the local health systems, and this is what we require to do by law. Actually, we know that this referral system actually has some obstacles, again, because there's no capacity. So what we do is we have a parallel system where we do referrals to different partner organizations that are working in the field. So for instance, Heartland Alliance International, Save the Children, have been receiving some of the cases that have where we see kind of critical cases. And then our supervisors and then the team at UCSF and our lead psychologists can also come in to address some of these difficult circumstances. And the second question, Venezuelan refugees, this program was originally created for displaced populations. Then we kind of start opening the scope for communities generally affected by conflict. And we didn't realize that by the third cohort of the program, we started receiving Venezuelan refugees who organically kind of took the step and started participating. And the next steps, so what we're preparing, we're trying to make up upfront adaptation so that we can better address the needs and the characteristics of Venezuelan refugees in Colombia. 2 million Venezuelan refugees in Colombia. Okay. So that's the program. And let me tell you about the impact evaluation. First, I'm going to start with a little bit of context. Maybe many of you know about this, but sometimes we lose track of the fact that Colombia is actually the country with the highest number of internally displaced persons in the world. So by the end of last year, 8.2 million internally displaced persons in Colombia. This is 17% of the Colombian population. This is almost 20% of all displaced persons. It's a higher number than what we have in Syria or the DRC. Maybe we lose track about this crisis because it's been a protracted conflict. So this is the stock of displaced persons that has been legally recognized since early 1990s. But displacement is still happening, as I will show you in a second. And displacement has affected pretty much every corner of the country. This map here on the left is showing you the intensity of displacement per 100,000 inhabitants across different municipalities of the country. And what you see is just like the heat map is totally activated. You have some spots here. This is where Bogotá and the nearby states are, the Amazon, but then you see pretty much the whole country has been affected by displacement. This is the number of displaced persons since 1997 and 2018. Displacement is still happening despite the peace agreement with the FARC guerrilla that was signed in 2016. Conflict is much active. This map on the right side, we took it from Robert Call, showing you a heat map of killings of social leaders. And when you see it's also spread around the country. And we're gonna work on this place here. which is also one of the municipalities more affected by conflict, is Tumaco. So this is on the border with Ecuador and the Pacific coast. It's a municipality mostly of Afro-Colombian population, 90% Afro-Colombian population, culturally rich, geographically rich. It's vibrant. It's actually a gorgeous place, but it's also been affected by conflict because coca leaf crops are grown here. And then this is just like a natural pathway for drug trade. And so different art groups have been always getting to Tumaco to get control of the drug trade. And as a result, they target the civilian population to get this territorial control. So we're going to work here. And this is just to highlight that this is a setting of that conflict. These are the homicide rates in Tumaco and in Colombia. What you see is a very stable trend in Colombia. And what you see here is the trend in Tumaco. What happened here, 2012, started the peace negotiations between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas. When we started discussing the possibility of bringing the program to this place was around here, 2016, 2017. There was kind of relatively safe conditions. And we were thinking we were coming to a post-conflict situation. When we started, you can see the spike in homicide rates. So homicide rate is 4 times higher than in Colombia. When you check the intensity of displacement, it's also it's 943 versus 235, I think. So it's also high intensity of displacement. And also a very poor context. So what you're seeing here is the map of poverty rates by block, by census block. And in general, 45% of the population is considered poor compared to 20% in Colombia. And you can see it's pretty much widespread across the municipality. All these are rivers where the art groups try to get control of these pathways to ship the coca trade out. And pretty much the only spots that you don't see here that are being activated in terms of poverty. This is an oil plant. This is the airport. This is the kind of the commercial tourist beach. Other than that, poverty is pretty much widespread. 80% of the population, of the economically active population, are devoted to some informal activity. So pretty vulnerable, both in terms of conflict and both in terms of socioeconomic dimensions. Okay, so to your question, Horacio, who are the participants? These are mothers in general, primary caregivers of young children served by early childhood development centers. These are centers that serve children around age 3 to 5 from vulnerable families. This is part of the From Cero a Siempre national policy, from zero to forever national policy, that has been evaluated by many, including there's a paper by Rockefeller and Sara Ramirez in 2019. I think this is World Development, showing positive effects of the rollout of these centers across the country, at least in terms of language and cognition, I think. And our experiment is going to assign some participants to a treatment status where they have access to Semillas de Apego, and in addition to the regular services that are provided by the centers. And then the control group, these are regular services provided by the centers, right? So no access to.
So families with 0 to 2?
Sorry?
If a family has only less than 2 years old, they're out.
If the family has a child that's less than 3 years, we don't find them because we're coming into the centers. And that was a decision we had to make to try to make it feasible for us to target the appropriate population and operate in the setting, right? And we only have, so this is going to be a clustered analysis. We're going to define the treatment at the cluster level, and the clusters are the centers, but we only have 18 centers, right? So at least in terms of statistical power, it would have made more sense to randomize individually. But the fact is that we couldn't. And the reason is that there are invisible borders across neighborhoods, across street, that you cannot cross. So for instance, take these 2 centers here, they're maybe 2 blocks away. and the community from this center cannot go to the community with the center. When we would come in, we would have to come in maybe go into a street, get the local leader of that neighborhood. He would check us in. We would run the, let's say, the surveys. If we're running to the other center, we could walk, we couldn't walk. You had to go out. Different local leader had to pick us up and then bring us in. So this actually prevents us from running the evaluation at the individual level. And we had to randomize, at the center level. Right, so we stratify, we follow a two-step approach. First, we assign at the center level, we take the ECDs, we have some data on ECD size and socioeconomic characteristics across the centers, and then we randomly assign to treatment or control status. So we have 9 centers in treatment, 9 in control. And then we take the census of the population served by the centers, and we randomly assign participants over 4 sequential cohorts. Our partner in the field wanted this program to persist. So we took the census and we defined, okay, you're in a treatment center, then you can participate in either cohort 1, 2, 3, or 4, right? And as children were coming in later, being enrolled later, we would add them to the list and then randomize it. In total, we have 1,300 participants, 700 assigned to treatment and 662 to control. Of course, we were worried about statistical power with very few clusters. This takes ahead as a function of the intra-cluster correlation. Luckily, at least what we see from admin data and baseline data is that the ICs are pretty low. These are pretty much centers that serve very similar underserved communities. And at least in our power calculations at the beginning, we had 80% statistical power to identify effects between 0.22 and 0.26 standard deviations without any controls for baseline prognostic variance. And these are the 2 registries of our study. Okay. So we collected baseline 4 weeks before the intervention started in the treatment group. The program ran for 15 weeks. We collected a 1-month follow-up then, and we came back and collected a second follow-up 32 weeks, 8 months after the program had ended.
Andrés, can I interrupt?
Yep.
To ask a question, sorry about that. Yeah, just to make it interactive, and there are some questions on the chat as well. So I was wondering, you gave us what the implementation, what the program design looks like. I was just wondering a little bit about the work that went into it beforehand, which is, is the science, the psychological science behind this particular intervention design, is it well settled, or is it something that, like who was involved in designing the program? And if somebody then displays any kind of severe stress symptoms, should there be some pharmacological treatment as opposed to just non-pharmacological treatment like we have here? And there's a related question from Catherine, that is there a referral system available when participants exhibit severe stress symptoms?
Good, thank you, Bushwick. Yeah, and because I moved here, I'm not seeing the chat now. Where? So yeah, so you can see me. I cannot see the chat, but 2 very important questions. Let me start with the second one. So yeah, the referral system, we just spoke about this. We have a kind of like official referral system to the public health system. We know that system doesn't work. There's only 1 trained psychologist in the municipality that can take into these cases. So when we had critical cases, we referred them to other partner organizations, Save the Children and Heartland Alliance International. Heartland Alliance International runs some community-led programs in mental health. And we also had our own team of psychologists that would come in and would try to follow up on these cases. In practice, we only had, I think, 6 cases out of 700 and something participants that we followed through these referral protocols. And then I think taking a step back and then going into your question, when we designed this project, so obviously I'm an economist. I didn't participate in the technical design. This was led by a team of psychologists at Los Andes and a team of psychologists at UCSF. And so first it took us approximately 6 months of focus groups and interviews with victims of conflict, forced displaced populations, with conversations with the National Victims Unit, which is the national institution that supports all victims initiatives. We did this in Bogotá mainly, and we ran a pilot to test the feasibility and acceptability of the program, to try to see if the way in which we approached the program and the contents is actually reasonable and well-grounded, and it's well received by the population. So this was conducted in 2015 with the support of the Ministry of Health in Colombia and the Inter-American Development Bank. Then when we moved to tobacco, it's a totally different setting. And then we ran again, maybe like a 6-month adaptation into the contents of the program and the way in which we bring the program to the community. That's where we decided to run the program through the early child development centers, because this allows us to find mothers who have young children and to come into the neighborhoods. We were only able to get into the neighborhoods because we were getting to the centers. We weren't able to go to the houses and so on. And this is going to matter also for the data that we collect. So I hope that answers your question. And maybe the other question, I will defer on whether there's merits or some cases merit pharmacological interventions. I think I would defer that maybe to the psychologists in our team, because I think that's beyond my my knowledge and training. Okay, so as we mentioned, we have 4 sequential cohorts. We follow the same data collection schedule for each of them. Here you have the different dates in which the data collection happened. And as you can see here, we're going to collect the final data for cohort 3 and 4 in March 2020 and June 2020. And of course, the pandemic came in, right? And so centers were closed by the end of February. Colombia went into national lockdown March 23rd, I think. And so this prevented us from going back to the field. We deployed a quick phone survey in April, 5 to 7 weeks after lockdown started. I think we were naive. We thought that maybe by administering a couple of scales and questionnaires over the phone, we could at least save some key dimensions that we can use for the full impact evaluation. But there, as soon as we started analyzing the data, we saw that there were just like high levels of stress, anxiety, parenting stress. People were already suffering. 70% or more lost their jobs or income. So actually, we made an amendment of the pre-analysis plan right as we were running the phone survey, and the 8-month follow-up results are going to use only the data for cohorts 1 and 2. And this is important because we also specified this in our original pre-analysis plan. We were not expecting to see any effects on the first follow-up. And this is pretty much consistent with or informed by the clinical trials of the child-parent relationship program where we are inspired of. We were expecting to see the effects in the second follow-up. And so, of course, we lost half of our sample here. You can't imagine the stress that we also experienced. Okay. So we're going to measure, we're going to be focusing on 4 main dimensions based on the theory of change of the program: maternal mental health, child-parent interactions, child mental health, early childhood. And we implement and administer a set of batteries that have been administered in other programs by other researchers or by ourselves, that have been translated and validated in many cases, that we know in other cases have appropriate psychometric characteristics. For the child-parent interactions, so one of the best strategies of the home inventory. We couldn't do this because we couldn't go into the neighborhoods. We had to run all the data collection in the center. So most of these are just self-reports from the caregiver who participated in the program or the control group. And for the child development, we have the preschool self-readiness assessment at baseline. And then we go with the administration of the DRCLAS at the second follow-up. And the brief toddler social-emotional assessment.
Sorry, did you see this? Where were the children, like the small children were with their parents, but where were the other ones?
So they're at the centers.
Okay, so they're being taken care of.
So they're taken care of, and the centers provide, they drop them out at around 9 a.m., pick them up at around 3 p.m., I think. So the program was actually implemented around the schedule of the moms or the caregivers. Usually either after they drop them out or before they pick them up, right? Children receive their food intake is mainly driven by the centers, right? And so this allowed us to have the participants fully focused on the program instead of like figure out what to do with their kids. I can go into this, but maybe for the sake of time, I'll jump and just mention that at least we got good psychometric properties. So we're gonna use all these scales and bundle them into these composite indices. We do this by GMM. We're gonna standardize by the control group in each wave. And we're gonna put all signs, we're gonna switch signs depending on the scale so that positive effects mean improvements. Okay. And we have-
So, Andrés, I'm sorry to interrupt. I have a question. Given that the focus of the paper is on mental health and maternal mental health, I was wondering if this checklist doesn't include depression, which seems to be one of the primary constructs predicting parental investment in children, and one reason why it's important to treat depression in women, and depression in particular, among all possible constructs.
Yeah, so very good question, Paula. Thank you. So the symptom checklist 9ER actually provides you data for 9 dimensions of mental health: anxiety, depression, phobic anxiety, sensitivity, hostility, and 3 other more. We've been using this one because what we realized in different work is, so at least economists that are starting to administer these scales usually focus on depression or focus on anxiety. But we're seeing that in many of our research, we pick up important domains when we check into other dimensions of mental health. So given the context and the setting of conflict, it's not only about depression, it's also about the sensitivity of these populations to what's happening in the setting. It's also about phobic anxiety, which is clearly tied up to experiences of displacement and violence. So we're able to see this in the different dimensions. For now, at least in the composite indices, we're just going to bundle everything together. And I can show you results in a second when we just take every measure by itself. But at least when we, yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
No, thank you for your question. Yeah, and there's a bracket here that's missing. Okay, but at least so the measures work well. We have good psychometric properties for the indices when we do internal consistency measures, when we do the confirmatory factor analysis. So in general, for some we're kind of borderline, and so we show that at least our results are robust if we include or we take out these measures. Okay. Okay, and some descriptives, average age of participants, 29 years old, 87% of them are the mothers. We have some grandmothers. We had 3 or 4 fathers actually who came up and participated. We know from their anecdotes, they were actually bullied by the community. This is very patriarchal, strong gender norms. And so the community were actually making fun of them when they decided to participate in women's groups. Child age was 2.5 years at the beginning of the program in general. Most of the children, the children that we measure is actually the second children. 82% of them direct victims of violence, exposed to, on average, 2.3 different violent events. 57% of them had been displaced at some point. And just let me show you this here. This is the distribution of the direct violent events. And on the right side, you see the maternal mental health index. So you can see like a very strong left and tail that highlights at least the sensitivity to conflict. Here, and also very poor. Sorry, this is not. So here we're comparing the asset index for the community in Tumaco, so participants in Tumaco, with the asset index for the nationally representative population that is collected by the data of the YELCA, a longitudinal survey that we were administering in Los Andes. And you can see just that the distribution in Tumaco is just like all the way to the left. So we're targeting the population that we want to target. Okay. And at least on baseline, what we see is that the dimensions that motivated this program, the effect of violence on maternal mental health, and the effect of maternal mental health on all these other dimensions, they show up at least in basic correlations at baseline. So we see that higher levels of violence in baseline are associated with worse maternal mental health, worse child-parent relationships, worse early child mental health. What we see is that when there's a kind of positive caregiver mental health, this is actually associated with better outcomes in the child-parent relationships and what's happening with the children. So at least with the scripted, we see that the theory of change is important here. So again, remember these were 15 sessions, and then we ran the program in 4 cohorts based on the insights of our partners like UCSF. We basically decided that when somebody participates in at least 6 sessions, they kind of graduate from the program. They have to be the first 6 sessions. And so you can see that at the beginning, it was only 40% of those that were invited ended up participating. And this, I think, has to do with the way in which we engage with communities. At the beginning, it was me talking to communities about what we wanted to run. Then we kind of realized it's better if actually the local facilitators do this process. And then you can see this greater engagement. On average, we have that participation was of 11 sessions, conditional of participating in at least 1 session. So when we see kind of the survival analysis, what happens is if they go to the first or second sessions, they pretty much stay. It was just hard at the beginning to try to get some people to participate. Okay. And our experiment works well. We have journal validity, balance on centric characteristics, balance on individual hassle characteristics. We don't find that any of the baseline characteristics are explaining participation in the program. And we did, I think, I can say this, I think a good job in terms of reducing attrition, only 4% and 10%, and not different between the treatment arms. I think this is a testament of the survey firm we hired, because we did I think a good job in trying to not lose track of the populations, even though they were migrating, even though some of them were being displaced as the program was happening. Okay, so how much time do we have? It's 3:30.
3:45.
Okay, so that's enough. So we're going to follow 2 empirical strategies. The first one exploits the random assignment to the treatment or control arms, again by the center level. So we're going to run lag-dependent variable models. We're going to run one of the composite indices for each of the dimensions here on the treatment status, on the composite index at baseline. We're going to control for baseline, family, and individual characteristics. We're going to control for the cohort fixed effects. Our baseline controls are demeaned and interacted with the treatment. And then we're going to adjust our cluster standard errors for the small number of clusters following Ustajovsky and Tipton. We also do some estimations with a wild bootstrap, and things are pretty consistent. We're gonna adjust for multiple hypothesis testing using the Q-Anderson, and then we're also, as a robustness check, we're gonna exploit an alternative source of variation, and this is the variation within treatment. So again, remember that within the treatment centers, we assigned randomly participants to 4 sequential cohorts. And then it turns out that this created this phase-in design that we can actually exploit. So at the moment, for instance, that the cohort 1 was participating in the first follow-up, cohort 2 was participating in basic. So we can use this to test also the first follow-up results, and we can use this to test for those second follow-up results. And this, we thought about this when we were adjusting our pre-analysis plan based on the interruptions from the pandemic, because it allows us to move away from the clustered assignment. So it might have a little bit more power. And then let me show you the results on the 4 main dimensions of the program. So first, in terms of maternal mental health, and I think as expected, we don't see much in the first photo. So in these tables, I'm showing you, like, for transparency, what happens when we only control for the lag-dependent variable, what happens when we include cohort fixed effects, what happens when we include controls, and what happens with the treatment on the treated, when we instrument by the random assignment. And we can see at the first follow-up is just not only not statistically significant, but pretty much these are almost zeros, right? And then what happens at the 8-month follow-up, we start picking up these sizable and statistically significant effects. Notice here that we're losing half of the sample. And this is pretty much because of the pandemic, because we weren't able to go back and follow up on these populations for cohorts 3 and 4 because of the lockdown. So even though we have a smaller sample size, and this translates into larger standard errors, we still see effects of 0.15 standard deviations in the maternal mental health dimension. And we see when we actually do the treatment and treated, this is actually 0.27 standard deviations. What happens with the child-parent relationships? We didn't expect this, but we were picking up statistically significant effects at the first follow-up of 0.14 standard deviations on the ITT, 0.22 standard deviations on the treatment and the treated. What happens at the 8-month follow-up? The effects are actually larger, even almost twice as large and much more precise, even though, again, here we're losing precision because of the smaller sample size. So at the 8-month follow-up, the effects on the child-parent relationship scale, composite index, 0.23 standard deviations on the ITT, 0.42 standard deviations on the treatment and the treated. And please interrupt if you want me to stop by some of these results. And then when you think about child dimensions, so one is the child mental health. This is measured by the child trauma symptom checklist Y. Not any effects here at the first follow-up. When we actually think there's, in the first follow-up, we don't see much in terms of mental health, early child development. But then again, you can notice at the 8-month follow-up, sizable and statistically significant effects in child mental health, and also in the early child development domain, right? So 0.17 and 0.21 effects of the intent to treat in early child development domains. And then just as to test what's happening, we do this within treatment strategy. And what we find here, the structure of these tables is different. The first 2 columns are showing first follow-ups. The first follow-up, the second 2 columns are showing the 8-month follow-ups. And what you can see here is pretty much the same picture as we were getting in the lag-dependent variable model. Not much in terms of the effects at the first follow-up, but then these sizable effects at the second follow-up.
Andrés, do you know, this might be an unfair question, do you know the standard deviation of the control group in these variables?
So we're standardizing by wave and the control groups. So in each,
It's one.
it's what?
This impacts, I mean, I know a bit the stuff of the ECT. They're large, they're huge.
They're large. But I'm going to show you that at least an ECD, they're large. But here, they're driven by the self-reported scale of the moms. We don't see much in the IDELA. So we see pretty much a null effect with a lot of dispersion. When we dig into the subdimensions of the IDELA, we're seeing some things in terms of socio-emotional and executive functions. But then the next step is what we're discussing in terms of trying to combine measures from different scales. Okay, and then we do this across the subdimension. So maybe Paula was asking this before, that we show you just that we split up the composite indices across the different subdimensions. This is the effect on the likelihood of being above the risk thresholds. And here, Paula, for instance, so you can see depression, anxiety, phobic anxiety, sensitivity, hostility, the measure of locus of control. So a negative effect here is a positive effect. This reduces the likelihood of being at risk. And so what you can see, at least in general, is kind of these, all the effects being on the right side. But as I was mentioning when I was here, this is the BITSI, the IDELA, kind of up. No effect, super imprecise. Okay. And then let me point to two additional effects in the 10 minutes that we have. So one, we're going to try to do some analysis of heterogeneity. So at first we had specified that we were going to use this causal forest protocols. We don't find any discernible patterns, and basically this probably because of statistical power. So these methods require very large samples. We don't have it. And actually, when we run this, the effects are pretty imprecise and inconsistent. They actually depend on a lot on the seeds that we choose. But then we follow kind of like a more standard method where we split the sample across key characteristics at baseline, and specifically displacement, baseline mental health, and socioeconomic vulnerability. And these are what we're finding. So one is in terms of the differential effects on whether the person was displaced or not. We don't see much. We don't see that many differences. And you can see that these are the p-values for the differences. Maybe one a little bit here, but they're too imprecise. When we see according to maternal mental health below the median, that's where we start picking up some heterogeneity. So we can see that at the 8-month follow-up, the effects are larger for those that had higher levels of maternal mental health problems. Right? So those that were at risk at baseline, that's when we start seeing like a more positive and stronger effects. And you can see that despite the small sample, these differences in the are statistically significant.
This is all corrected for multiple hypothesis testing.
Yes. Yeah, and so I'm not reporting the. So I need to check. So the first I need to check here why we're reporting the p-value, not the q-value. And then when we check also across socioeconomic vulnerability, we're seeing that at least it seems that the effects are being positive for those that are not extremely poor. So within a very poor environment, at least those that are below the median in that asset index that I showed you, they are the ones that are, so the ones not below that asset median index, they're the ones where we start picking up some effects. Again, at least in mental health, that's where it's a sizable effect. So this kind of takes us a little bit, points into a direction sort of a Maslow hierarchy of needs. So maybe interesting dimensions when we think about future programs, about whether this has to be run or integrated within the early child development centers where they at least get some type of social services. And this is going to be important. And we were speaking about this earlier in terms of how do we, for instance, target this program to Venezuelan refugees. So 2 million refugees that are in dire circumstances. Many of them are not being able to access conditional cash transfers or centers. So how does it work when you don't have at least the food to feed your kids? Do you have like the space for this emotional process and growth?
But do you think they would be going to cities as poor as Tumaco? I mean, probably they
are.
Yeah.
They are. So some of them are getting to Tumaco because it's in the border with Ecuador. So some of them, as they migrate across the country, they start selecting the places where they're going to live. The majority come to big cities, but you start seeing that across rural areas, they're also getting their. Okay, and maybe the second result that I wanted to highlight is this kind of the effect of the COVID pandemic. So this is cohorts 3 and 4. This was the evolution and baseline. First follow-up, we're expecting something like this based on what was happening in cohorts 1 and 2. We weren't able to measure this. We deployed the phone survey, and what you see is this kind of very strong and sizable increase in at-risk symptoms of anxiety. We see 4 weeks into the pandemic, an increase in 14 percentage points in at-risk symptoms of anxiety, 5 percentage points for depression, 10 percentage points for parent distress. I think so. This was when lockdown was we had just gone into lockdown, but then 11 months later, we deployed a second survey in November, and we see still very kind of sizable effects for anxiety, depression, and stress. Some preliminary results that I don't want to stress that much. We do see that at the November 2020 follow-up phone survey, it seems that the treatment helped mitigating some of these effects. And first paper was actually, so the paper analyzing the effects on the first follow-up was published last year at the Lancet Global Health. Okay. So 5 minutes left, and let me just wrap up. Again, I think what we try to innovate here is to address, and I think it's motivated by the effects of conflict on maternal mental health, and how actually this is important by itself, but also important because it affects the capacity of these caregivers to provide these stimulating and developmentally appropriate settings for the children. I think the innovation also is implementing this through the community.
Yeah, sorry to, before you conclude, one thing that I'm this is very interesting, but one thing that I was perplexed is, why did you decide to go to the CDIs? And what I remind is that, for instance, if you were to use, I don't know Tumaco at all, so it might be not feasible there, but if you go to the FAMI is and you could do the randomization across families, because already they have meetings in groups. It seemed to me a very natural environment where you try to do that kind of intervention. The family mothers are typically local women. You would, implement it in that context. You will get a much larger sample size probably. And it's true that the family asks for 0 to 2, but lots of these ladies, in any case, first of all, it's a good time to do the intervention, and they might have older children, given that your focus is on the mothers. So did you, maybe there are no families in Tumaco?
So to be honest, I'm not sure if they have families in Tumaco. I never heard about the program operating as we were running this intervention. So the focus on the CAEs was basically because we partnered up with an organization in the field called Genesis Foundation, which was our operator for the ICBF for the early child development centers. And so they allowed, okay, so come in and you can run the program here. But I think your comment is very, very important as we're now trying to figure out how to scale.
You should have a chat with the ICBF because family is ICBF.
Yep.
So to me, it seems the more because you already have groups like it's actually smaller than 15. There was why I asked the question at the beginning.
Yeah.
It's like 9 or 10. Something else. And the children go there because they're really small between 0 and 2.
So that's a very good comment. Thank you. And I think it helps us now. And just to wrap up, maybe, so again, I discussed this at length, this implementation in the context of ongoing conflict, of a complex current trauma. And I think that, like in general, the results speak both to the need. We need to think hard about these programs. We need to bring them in. We need to evaluate them, but also that it's not only needed, but also feasible, right? And when we think about cost effectiveness or scalability, cost per participant was $435. The nearest program for the ICBF, they were running a program called Mi Familia. They were starting to design it before the pandemic. The program per participant was $600.
This is per year.
Per year. Per participant of the per year. And then the nearest CBT, just not comparable, but the nearest CBT program is $6,000, right? So we can do this, and we can do this properly at I think a reasonable cost, right? And so right now we're working on what we call at-scale pilot. We're handing in the operation to an external partner, actually Heartland Alliance, which was, if you remember, the organization in Tumaco that provided some mental health protocols. We're moving towards 5 municipalities in the Caribbean coast, in the Pacific region, different populations in the Caribbean coast of Barranquilla and Soledad, which have high influx of Venezuelan refugees. So we're already starting to adapt the implementation there. And there's an ongoing conversation to enhance the model with some play-based activities. And again, I mentioned at the beginning, we're trying to address a different restriction. But of course, this doesn't mean that the restrictions that other programs are trying to address are not there. So how can we complement these strategies? And we're working with Sesame Workshop to try to complement, maybe have some activities for the children. And for this part, we're going to be using an implementation science evaluation framework. So mostly focusing on the processes and not on the impacts. We're going to do a pre-post follow-up, but not a proper impact evaluation. And I think that's it. So I think right on time, maybe I went for 1 more minute. And so thank you again for the time and for the opportunity to present here. Your comments, and I don't know if there's something in the chat.
No, there are no more questions in the chat. So I don't know if the audience in Zoom would like to ask some questions.
Somebody wants to follow up. Oh no.
Teresa or Andres, can I ask a question?
Yes, go.
So I saw at the beginning of the talk and at the end of the talk as well that 50% of your sample were IDPs. So I assume that everyone else was more or less considered to be part of the host community. So I guess out of curiosity, I wanted to ask you if you observe differences in the type of trauma and violence that these two populations have experienced. And if you do observe differences, whether I would be surprised that there are no heterogeneous effect along that dimension. And I think it would be an important point for the paper to say, regardless of the type of exposure to violence that these populations experience, which to me could be either betrayal trauma in the form of IPD or exposure to conflict, the fact that the intervention works regardless of the type of trauma that these women are exposed to could be an interesting angle to emphasize in this paper.
Okay, yeah, so thank you. I think that's a great comment. So one, my perception is that we're not picking up, so my intuition was that we were going to be picking up heterogeneity across the IDP dimension. We don't, but I think maybe there's a chance that this is just basically because of lack of sample power, right? So in general, you need kind of 16 times the like a larger sample to be picking up some heterogeneity in some of these dimensions, and that's I think where your comment, Horacio, on adjusting for multiple hypothesis testing comes in neatly. So that's part of the story. Then second part, we haven't tested or analyzed the data in this dimension that you mentioned in terms of differences in the exposure to violence or trauma among displaced and non-displaced persons. These are general communities that some of them have been displaced within the own municipality from different neighborhoods. As different armed groups get to a neighborhood, the community has to move away. They're pretty much integrated in the communities. We don't have displaced camps in Colombia. The displaced arrive and they're pretty much the same culture. Everything is the same, and they settle in outskirts of the cities. In Tumaco is pretty much the same neighborhood. So at least when you talk to people, you don't see any kind of main differences. But we can think about analyzing the data also in the way that you proposed. And I think your comment in terms of like, if this works for these two kind of dimensions, that's a good point to emphasize. Thank you so much for that comment.
So if you join me thanking Andres for the presentation, and any extra question, you can send an email there. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much.